How's it going, YouTube? Coming to today with another video. And today, guys, what the bring to you is going to be where to Handtrap Dictionary. Now, I'm really excited to bring this video because there's so many different decks to talk about, and with the remainder national championships coming up, I want to make sure that everyone's as prepared as possible. Today, we're going to be covering several decks, and I want to make sure that you know exactly where to Handtrap, know exactly the reasoning behind it, and we're going to go in detail today. So if you haven't already checked my sponsors over in RW, Cloud, Gem, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, and Grimoire, definitely go ahead and check them all out down below in the description. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already for all the where to hand traps, all of the guides, all of the knowledgeable content. I appreciate all the support in the channel. Thank you all so much. Let's hop right on into where to hand trap dictionary. The first one I'm going to have for you today is going to be Lunalight. So Lunalight is going to be a deck that is going to be in the room at Nationals, and this is something that you really want to make sure that you are aware of because the deck itself can be very scary. There are a few very key choke points though. Having an out for Liger Dancer is going to be very important at this event. You're going to want some kind of out. They are something like 2 or 3 on their end board, and that's kind of scary. DD Crow onto Martin. Martin does search things like Masquerade, so you want to make sure that you just get rid of it when it tries to come back to the board, because that way your opponent just doesn't have access to the extra card, because Masquerade is actually really solid. And you want to be able to either Bell or Ogre Wolf or Masquerade's effect to go ahead and Miracle Fusion. Don't let your opponent be able to do that. It's really scary because, again, Liger Dancer is a card. Plus, even like Perfumer is really good, being able to get 2 Perfume, which we couldn't prior. Which this deck has just gotten so crazy of a buff that you want to make sure that you shut off the Miracle Fusions as soon as possible because you do not want to see the end board of this deck. A lot of times, like, SP, Baguska, Liger, like, it's a big end board that you got to deal with. Ashing the Hound to someone from deck, we don't want that to happen. And then Valor Imperm onto Gold Leo. This is the card that starts it all. If you got one Gold Leo just go uninterrupted, it's going to be a rough day. Especially if the pilot knows what they're doing with the deck. Lancey is a card that will help you against this deck. Again, it just beats the Miracle Fusions. The next deck I have for you today is going to be MitsuOrcust. You want to make sure that this deck is also on your radar. It's going to be very popular. It just got 8 regional tops the second the deck dropped, so this is something that you really want to make sure you know what it does. Valor Imperm onto Girsu. This is going to be extremely important. You do not want this card resolving. It is very strong just by itself. You have Ash on Harp Horror. If you want to go ahead and Ash Saji, I don't recommend ever ashing Habakiri because if they have Saji anyways, then you're just kind of punished, right? And that's not great. So I would rather just Ash the Harp Horror. But if you do see your opponent going activate Habakiri, pitch Saji, I'm just ashing Saji immediately because I'd rather deal with the Mitsu cards with hand traps and just let the Orcust cards go off than the other way around, honestly. You can Bell the effect of Symbol Skeleton. This is usually on your own turn because this is going to stop the Dingirsu from coming back. Or you can just go ahead and DD Crow the target of Symbol Skeleton so you don't allow your opponent to be able to bring something back. Now, as for Memento, this is always forever changing, but I think this is now going to be the most accurate throughout the remainder of this deck unless they get new support. So, DD Crow onto Gadget coming back to the board. This is really important because you don't allow your opponent to get back to things like Memento Fusion and even to Sleepy, which can be a huge deal because if you cut off ways to fuse in this deck, the deck still can't really do a whole lot. They can do a little bit, but not like everything they want because the number one way to ash this deck is still Creation King. It's just the best one here. You can definitely Bell the Fusion, but definitely ash Creation King because the triple dump is something that you just don't want to happen, right? Like that's just better than the 2 that Horse gives you. But go ahead and Ogre the Field Spell, and then Valor Imperm the Horse. A lot of times you want to do this preemptively because there's so many ways to dodge in the deck, so when your opponent summons the Horse, just go ahead and Valor Imperm, don't wait for the effect. As for Melodious, we are seeing a lot of Melodious lately. Bell and Ash both work on Ostinato. This was a really weird one because it's just all one effect, but it is separated. I don't know, it's just a really weird card text on Ostinato that we already discovered and went through beforehand, but you can Bell Ostinato, you can Ash Ostinato, it's the best one to hit. You can Bell the effect of Botcha to go ahead and summon back, especially if you Valor Imperm on the Botcha, which you should, and then they go ahead and go for Gravity Controller and go Botcha target like the Refrain. At that point, you definitely can just go ahead and Crow the Refrain just so your opponent can't go full combo anyway. But I'm just belling the effect of the Botcha and Grave at that point to make sure they can't summon back. And a lot of times, your opponent's trying to loop Soprano, so I'm just going to go ahead and Crow the Soprano because this is going to be the main culprit of fusing in the deck outside of like your basic Ostinato, what have you. You also can Ogre the Couplet, which allows them to get to the Concerto, which is going to be their fusion spell. You also can Ogre the Link too, because of the fact that that's going to be able to summon to the zones it points to, and if it's gone, they can't summon. So you always got to prioritize what you're seeing first, right? So like if your opponent summons Botcha, Veiler Impermanent, and then if they link it off, they go for the Refrain, you want to Crow the Refrain or Bell the effect of Botcha. If your opponent starts looping the Soprano, that's where the big issue is. Crow the Soprano, right? So these are the things that you got to look for, and where to hand trap sometimes isn't always just so set in stone because of the fact that your opponent is going to open different every time. So sometimes you have to adjust on the fly, and these are the adjustments that you have to make. Now for MitsuRy, I do believe that it's still corrected to duo drive. I still want to make sure this card doesn't go off and get to things like Cross. Some lists cut Cross, but not every list. I feel like it's still really standard to play Cross because that card's still really crazy. I am still going to say to Ash Sasaji though, because the last thing that you want is your opponent just going ahead and Dugarsing back a Saji instead of you just ashing the Saji. Because that's what happens when you ash the Habakiri, and they're like, oh, so we just got to put it in grave and then bring it back, right? So that gets really awkward, and I'd rather just go ahead and deal with this because getting access to that ritual spell is really important, considering most people only run the one. Now, you do want to hold the bell for your own turn when your opponent tries to bring back the Mirakumo. This is really important because you don't want your board wiped, so this is just more of a defensive card in this matchup than it is a proactive card. So this is something that can make sure that your board is safe, which is really solid. The Nibiru and Crow definitely depend. If your opponent isn't even on Cross, I feel like it's pretty obvious at that point that you kind of just wait before your opponent tries to gain more advantage or put up like a crazier board. In my opinion, that's usually when like you see dual drive start hitting the board because you still want to make sure that you can prevent your opponent from getting to additional bodies. But Nibiru is really solid because of the fact that if your opponent starts tributing everything like their Mirakumo, their Futo, their Habakiri, and they end their turn, and then you go end of main phase and Nibiru them, their board doesn't come back. They only get it back via prayer, which is pretty crazy because a lot of people are just not respecting that. So we're seeing a lot more people use Nibiru right now because their board just doesn't come back. So you might want to stop using your Mirakumo as a tribute and just leave it on the board, because even if you get nibbed, it comes back, which is still pretty solid. DD Crow, I'm probably just waiting until something like Mirakumo goes to the graveyard, because when it tries to come back, even if they're going to be able to search, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to Crow it, because now your opponent has to get to Kusanagi again and then bring back the Mirakumo. It's going to be really awkward and something that you really don't have to deal with at that point, right? So either you're going to kill them in that follow-up turn or you're going to deal with it on the follow-up turn. So that's something that you really got to think about, but I would always go ahead and go after these choke points, especially Bell on the Mirakumo on your own turn, because I just don't want my board wiped. Now for Fiendsmith Odion, definitely go ahead and Veiler Imperm the Man with the Mark, and you can also Ash the Circuit. These two cards are really important to stop because you stop your opponent from getting to Temple, which means that your opponent can't just start flipping trap cards on their turn, which is really important. Yes, they can still go like Fiendsmith combo, but that doesn't really matter because the Fiendsmith cards are easy to handle, but like when your opponent starts setting up a full board of back row, that's a little bit more of an issue, right? But I definitely like going ahead and using Ghost Ogre onto Desiree. You can Bell or Crow the Engraver, and then Nibiru right when your opponent has the Engraver and Necro equip on board when they represent the Caesar coming out, because this is something that you want to make sure that you have a plan for the Fiendsmith cards, because if you can stop the Odion cards early and then just have to deal with the Fiendsmith cards, it's pretty easy at that point. Whether you're dealing with just a Caesar in Paradise or you're dealing with Desiree itself, there's a lot of play around of those cards, and it's not necessarily like the end of the world, right? So definitely not by any means like a tier 1 or 1.5 deck. It's more like tier 2, but it is something that you could see, and I want to make sure that you are prepared for this. Now for Primite Blue-Eyes, this deck is going to be in the room, let me tell you. This is a very popular deck right now. It's a very good deck right now. And the Veiler Imperm spot has changed to the Ether Barrel. A lot of times your opponent will just play like Drill Beam control. You want to make sure that you're stopping this because it is really ignorant once you get into it, right? Because your opponent just has the Drill Beam on top of everything else, and it's something that we just don't want to deal with, right? So if your opponent leads Barrel, I'm just stopping it immediately, because then you don't have to deal with load, you don't have to deal with Drill Beam, and, you know, it's really nice to be able to just cut off a lot of the engine immediately. If my opponent normaled like Sage, I'm just going to let it resolve, right? Like, I don't care that much. If they're not leading Barrel, I'm still going to hit the Link 1 with Veiler Imperm for sure. But if they're leading Barrel, I'm always hitting that with a Handtrap. Ogre onto Mausoleum of White because you don't want your opponent to be able to get to the Blue-Eyes Engrave. Ash onto Witches. This is like the most common one that you want to do here. I really like Bell onto Roar because a lot of times they feel real safe with Roar to have it if you stop them somewhere else. So if you have like Bell and something else, a lot of times Bell on Roar can be really detrimental. But you definitely can Crow or Bell the Maiden of Void as well to try and stop your opponent from getting to that Spirit Dragon. But a lot of times your opponent will just like normal summon a Handtrap or something. It happens quite often. But it is still nice to be able to get rid of this card so your opponent just doesn't have it. The next one here is Crystron. Definitely go ahead and Crow the Smiger. This card is really solid for the deck, being able to get to things like Inclusion, that can get to Solfador. Solfador definitely gets hit with Valor Imperium because like the double dump is crazy and you want to make sure that you're just stopping that immediately. Ogre onto the Cluster. This card is really annoying to deal with. Honestly, it really is. You can Ash the Imseti if they lead it. I probably will myself. But if you are worried about the Tristalos, you can always hold Ash for your turn, and then if your opponent goes to use Tristalos, you can always go ahead and Ash that as well, so your opponent just can't get free value. Regenesis. Now, the Bystial variant is the most popular, so I'm going to cover that today instead of the Cashier variant. It's not going to be the most popular anymore. I think that the Bystial cards have been doing way better in the deck anyway, so this is something that I want to make sure that you're aware of. Crow preemptively onto the Lubellion, just so they can't summon it back to the board and get to Regained. Bell on the Birth. You want to make sure that you're belling Birth. It's a very strong card. It's a very annoying card. And this is something where I feel like the biggest choke point in the deck, honestly, is just belling this. Or Valor Imperium onto Lord. Because a lot of people are just stopping the Archfiend blanketly. But like if you stop the Lord so they can't get to Birth, it's really solid. And you stop a lot of the shenanigans, right? I really do like that. Ash on the Archfiend is fine. You can also Ash Code. Either one of these is fine. I'm probably just going after the Archfiend if I see it first, or if I see Code first, I'll just Ash Code. It really just depends on which one you see first. This is also a deck that you do not want to keep Fuit in for. You want to strictly just keep your Perulia, because that card will do a lot of work against this deck. Go ahead and use DD Crow when your opponent tries to summon the Vengeance out of Graveyard, or just Bell it. This is a card that you just don't want to see on board. The card is honestly very scary, and it's something that can put up a lot of board presence. You can also Impulse the second effect because it does attempt to summon from the extra deck. So that is a pretty crazy card all in all. Make sure that you stop this at all costs and do not let it stay on the board. It's very not fun to deal with. Bell onto Wanted. If my opponent goes draw phase Wanted poster, I'm probably just belling it, honestly. Just stopping your opponent from getting access to the Deception. This is very reminiscent of Snake Eye format. If your opponent goes Wanted and draw phase, a lot of times you were just belling it 100% of the time. Ash onto the LZ. If you see the LZ trying to activate immediately, and it's like the first action, I'm ashing that. But if my opponent just goes like Witch set Deception, Deception Tribute Witch, I'm ashing that all day long. So this is another situation of whichever one you see first. You can also Ogre Deception, is very strong. You just want to make sure your opponent doesn't get to things like the Arcelago and the Sylvia, just to be able to keep their plays moving along. And then if your opponent starts with Sylvie, I'm just Valor Imperiuming that immediately. It's just another way for them to go full combo, and I just don't want to see that happen. So the most common variant of Gem Knight right now is just the Blind Second build. You're not really playing the Fiendsmith cards, you're just going Blind Second. So this is something that I want to make sure that you're like extremely aware of because it's doing very well as the Blind Second. So Nibiru is like kind of weird. It's not like the greatest, but if your opponent's like actively trying to kill you going second, right, that's something that can kind of just like stop them in their tracks or make it really hard. So especially if you're playing something like Mitsu cards in your deck and then you're able to just like trigger your own Mirakumo to come back and whatnot, it's pretty good. But I do like DD Crow or Bell onto the Nephrom. Make sure that you do not let this card touch the board, because it's going to be able to get them to Gem Armadillo. Armadillo is going to summon and get them to like Quartz. There's a lot of different things that you can do in this deck that are pretty scary, but this is definitely one of those things that I want to make sure this is cut off as soon as possible. You can also DD Crow onto the Gem Fusion, which I think is really solid. It makes Dispersion a little less potent. I really do like getting rid of the Fusion though, because it is recurable. You can Ash Dispersion. I heavily recommend ashing that first effect of Dispersion 100%. You don't want your opponent using things from deck. But you also can Ash the Absorb Fusion. Absorb and Scatter Fusion are both cards that people are running in only the Blind Second builds. You don't really see them in the going first builds, just because they have a different game plan. But I do like hitting the Dispersion or Ogre the Scatter Fusion. Either of these are really fine to do. Valor Imperm onto the Phantom Quartz, though, just another way to be able to fuse, and it's just overall a lot of value in a card being able to add a gem as well. We got P.U.N.K up next, so Deer Note is going to be one of the biggest culprits of being able to get into a lot more of your combos. Being able to end with a monster that allows you to fuse, being able to cut off access to tuners, Crow or Bell onto the effect of this and the target. You don't want your opponent to be able to extend even more. I like ashing and Valor Imperm onto Carp. I think nothing is more important in this deck than just stopping Carp, because this is going to be the most value for your opponent, so make sure that you are just stopping Carp overall. The Rising skill does summon from deck, so you can ash that if you want, but I'm more focused just heavily on stopping Carp. And then I really like Ogre in this matchup. Extreme Session is annoying. It's really annoying, and this is something that you want to make sure that you do hit with Ogre. Free draws, free summons, just a card that does too much entirely. So stop Carp, stop the field spell, you'll be okay. The next one up is going to be Tenpai Ruler. You 110% want to just go ahead and DD Crow the Krista, or Bell the effect of Chasma, because this is going to dump the Redox to try to summon back the Krista. This is something that you want to make sure that you are just stopping immediately, because this will lock you out of the game. You also can go ahead and Bell the Biden. If your opponent is trying to just go for game, you can Bell Biden, and it's like really awkward. It puts your opponent in a really weird spot where they're like, oh, I don't get Chandra back, or oh, I don't get another body back. It gets really awkward, but I do like this play a lot, but definitely stop Krista. You can definitely ash the Genroku. It's funny, in this deck, Pydra isn't that great of a card to start with. You actually want to start with Dora Dora, because Dora Dora gets you into Genroku, and then Genroku can extend you from there. So a lot of times people are going through that route in this deck, so definitely ash the Genroku. This is going to be a huge choke point for the deck. Ogre onto Summoning, and then Valor Imperm onto Chasma. Again, you don't want your opponent to be able to extend through this card, and you just don't want to be able to see your opponent get to Krista in the first place. So if you just have Valor Imperm, they can't dump it off title. So that's something that you got to be really careful of. But this deck can be very scary, but going first, they are trying to lock you out of the game. As for Vanquish Soul, I don't really think that we're going to see a whole lot of this at the NAWCQ, but I do think someone's going to top with it. You can definitely go ahead and Ogre the field spell. The card's really solid, being able to get you more advantage. Valor Imperm onto Rosin, or just Ash Rosin. You can Ash the Stake Your Soul if they start it. I think that's fine to just go ahead and Ash right away. But I definitely like holding Imperm for my own turn, and then in the draw phase, going Imperm onto the Rock of the Vanquisher, so you don't get any, like, surprises later on, right? I think that's really solid. Right now, people are still playing, like, one copy of Continue, so you can go ahead and Crow whatever the target is, and then you can Bell Continue. This is another card that's allowing your opponent to be able to make things like Baguska on the fly. But again, remember that if your opponent is going ahead and just summoning out Holy Sue by itself, and they actually have the cards to extend off that you want to make sure that you're stopping that, because the Holy Sue is either going to be a Snatch Shield, or it's going to represent 2 pops, because your opponent can go the Holy Sue on board, reveal Fire Dark, summon Rosin, Rosin search, Rosin blow up a card with Fire Dark, and then it searched the Caesar, bounce back the Holy Sue. Now they have Fire Dark Earth. Now the Caesar can come down by bouncing back the Holy Sue and pop a card non-targeting. So the deck can do quite a lot right now, and you want to make sure that you're prepared for that. Also, I don't really talk about Impulse like too directly, but you want to Impulse Snow Devil. If anything's going to be like really positive for you when you're going second, you want to Impulse the Snow Devil. This is something that is going to be a major problem. For Mermail, this can be very specific, but so you can actually go ahead and Crow things that are sent for cost. So if your opponent goes like the Minstrel sending the Shadow Squad, you can Crow Shadow Squad, so at resolution it's in a new location and it doesn't get a window to activate, which is fantastic and a really good way to hit this deck. A lot of times it's going to depend on Bell, because there's 2 main spots that you can. You can hit the Anemone, which is another card that you can hit with Ogre. I really do like that too, because it has to summon to the zone that it points to. But you can also Bell the effect of Prince to bring back like the Poseidon from grave. This is a huge thing that your opponent will do, especially toward your turn when they're just pitching things to the graveyard, because of the fact that they get the advantage once they go Abyss Rhine, pitching the Neptibus from their hand, and then they get to draw a card. Neptibus bring back the Poseidon, and then Poseidon can go ahead and just bounce something, and then dump the infantry, which can pop something. So I almost like holding Bell for my own turn, and then using Bell onto the Prince effect to bring back the Poseidon. And this is going to be something that you see a lot more of in the game, where sometimes you want to hold hand traps for your own turn because it can be a lot more beneficial on your turn than it can be on your opponent's turn. I'm always stopping the Abyss Shrine. I just don't want my opponent to get to the Coelacanth. It's just going to be a lot of bodies hitting the board, and I don't want to deal with it. And then Valor Imperium onto the Prima Donna, because it's going to stop access to the Water Barrier statue, and this is going to be probably the most important thing in the deck right now. Do not get locked out by the water statue if you do not have to. Evil Twin. Now, this is a deck that's been popping up everywhere, and so this is something that I do heavily focus on the Fiendsmith cards than I do on the Evil Twin cards, because this deck is literally just Fiendsmith with a small Evil Twin package for the most part. Every time you see this deck, that's what it's going to be. Valor Imperium in this deck are really bad. I really don't like using these cards against this deck. You can hold Imperium for your own turn, though, and hit Caesar, because that's going to be a huge issue. And there is a very specific line to be able to summon Desiree and Caesar, but a lot of times people are not going for that, so it's going to be just Imperium with Caesar, Ogre onto Desiree, Ash onto Requiem. You can Bell the effect of Trouble Sunny when they tribute it to bring back 2, and that's really impactful too, because they don't get the pop and the draw. And then Nibiru onto the Necroquip and the Engraver, representing the Caesar. And then you can always go ahead and Crow the Engraver to stop the Caesar from coming out. If you're looking at your hand, you're like, I can't play through Caesar, you want to stop it at all cost. But you can also go ahead and DD Crow the Link too, because your opponent only usually plays 1 and 1. Sometimes you see lists that play a little bit more too, but just comparing a lot of the topping lists lately, they just play 1. So getting rid of it immediately is really nice, because then they really have to rely on their Fiendsmith cards to carry them to victory, which is not always the easiest task. So Onomat Ry is very similar to Heradic Ry in the sense that you want to go ahead and DD Crow Ouroboros in the grave when they use the Eclipse Twin to bring it back. And you can also Bell the effect of Eclipse Twin to not be able to bring back Ouroboros, because both of these decks are going to be going to do the same thing. They're trying to just hand loop you, and they have a lot of bodies to do it. Let me tell you, I tested Onomat Ry the other day. A lot of bodies. Now, you can Ash 2 different cards. You can Ash the Goblin Bird because it summons from deck, or you can Ash the Onomatopoeia, and that card adds 2, and I think that that's a really solid spot to Ash. You don't let your opponent get to like multiple extenders. It just depends on what your opponent leads with. If my opponent leads with Para, I'm probably just Ashing that, but if my opponent leads with the Goblinberg, I'm probably just Ashing that. I do still like Ogre, Valor Imperium onto Duo Drive. Again, cut off access to the cross, so your opponent can't just like Ouroboros loop you with a negate on board, especially if you have 2 hand traps. But you can go ahead and Valor Imperium the Goblinberg as well. Just know that it is Ryzeal, and extenders are very real, and that they could have that to just like extend anyways, as that wouldn't even matter too much. Last but not least here, we have Maliss. There's a couple spots that are really important to think about here. Ogre onto any Link 2 that hits the board just to keep them off of anything that they could be going into a Link 3 with. The first name that hits the board, you want to go ahead and Valor Imperium onto that just to make sure that your opponent can't just start play. If they go Normal Dormouse, you Valor, sometimes they'll just pass. A lot of times they'll open like their Wizard, or they'll open a Bystial or something, but you still want to take the high rolly chances, especially in a Game 1 scenario. Ashing on the binder so it can't come back. A lot of people are not playing the GWC, they're siding it. Now, I've seen some lists put it back in the main, but there's a lot of lists that are still siding it. So if you go ahead and Ash the binder, the only way to get it back is by Cryptor Effect, and that means they have to combo a lot more without binder. So that's really good to see. If your opponent normal summons a Chesty Cat, it's the same thing as Dormouse as the first name. I'm probably just stopping it immediately so my opponent doesn't get like free extension. Because a lot of times this is like the greedy play, where your opponent has like a good starter and they have Chesty Cat, and this one loses to more, and then they'll just pass on like the one Lingeribo, or they'll just pass on Chesty, right? So I guess a little awkward. Bell onto the effect of Whitebinder on board to banish. I like that one a lot. But if my opponent is really needing an extender and they activate Underground, I'm probably just belling the Underground. You can definitely Crow in this deck, but it's not the best card to use. I would rather use just like Bell over Crow. But I think that Crow gets a lot of value, especially if your opponent already banished a binder, and then they try to bring things back with the Akko Talker, and then you Crow binder. Again, it just all depends if you see GWC or not, but if you don't, it gets really awkward, because now their turn's over because they're attempting to use the Akko Talker, and they're going to bring back that ransom, but they're not bringing back that binder. And then you also can do the same thing right before you see the Akko Talker. If there's no firewall, then you can just go ahead and Nibiru onto the Akko Talker effect. But if you see the firewall, you want to go ahead and preemptively Nibiru, because your opponent can just like negate by pitching the firewall, right? So that's something that you really want to think about. but Maliss is still going to be in the room, still going to be very prevalent. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, definitely go ahead and join my Twitter, Twitch, Discord, Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. I appreciate all your support and much more Where to Handtraps to come.